Welcome to On Microsoft. Conversations with thought leaders in Microsoft technologies.
So to change the subject, this Office programming thing, programming against COM, we know that people keep doing it, and actually very happy and productively doing it, but are struggling to do it from C#. So can you tell us about what kinds of things we're doing to make that easier?
Sure. I'll speak a bit about that. For many years, I personally, and we sort of in the industry in general, have been trying to convince people that there's a real value to talking to Office through languages like C# and VB and whatnot. And I worked on the Visual Studio Tools for Office team for many years working on that. And something that we learned in doing that is that there are certain features in C# that make it a very poor experience to program against the Office object model. And you could argue that these are design flaws in the Office object model, but then you have to think, well, that object model was designed years before C# came along, so it's not really that fair to point at it and say, well, it doesn't work with this particular world very well. We have to adapt to it. So what we're doing is we're adding some heuristics to the language so that if, for example, you are talking to, say, a method on Word that has, a dozen parameters, and a lot of them are optional, and you only want to pass a couple of them, today in C# you would have to create a bunch of sort of type missing objects and then pass them all and pass them by reference, and it looks very ugly, and it obscures the meaning of the code, right? It makes the mechanism very apparent and the meaning kind of gets lost. So by making some fairly simple changes to how we handle the call site in the language, we can say, okay, well, you can now pass arguments by name, and you can omit arguments that you would like to be missing. And the compiler will automatically figure out, it's like, oh, I see you're calling a COM object through an interface, and that there are some reference parameters, and you've omitted them, so I will pass the magic missing value on your behalf, and it all looks much nicer.
Yeah, I think it breaks actually into two groups of features in C# 4.0. Some features that are genuine new language features, like optional parameters and the ability to specify named arguments in method calls. And this is a feature that can be used both for Office interoperability or just as a general purpose language feature in C#. Then there are, on top of that, some additional things that we did specifically to make COM interoperability better. And these are kind of esoteric, strange little corners, that back in old A automation style type libraries, you could do some pretty wonky things like have ref parameters that have default values and so forth. And we have previously not really paid a lot of attention to that. And in a sense, we've had the design goal here to make it as easy to program against the Office automation model in C# as it is in VBA. Just make it look right. Make it as easy as it used to be. and you can instead say that we're finally paying the backwards compatibility tax that perhaps we should have paid earlier, but at least now we're getting it done. Mm-hmm. And in the trade, then we're also getting these nice new language features called optional and named parameters, which people have asked for a long time, and which actually have been supported by VB as well. So. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so onto the last bucket. You talked about co- and contravariant generics or something like that?
Right.
What on earth is that?
Everybody always gets very nervous when I start talking about covariance and covariance.
Okay, Anders, what on earth is that?
It's a lot of sort of mathematical sounding terms, but the sort of gist of it is that now a number of generic interfaces work the way you expect that they would. Right? A question I get all the time is, I have a sequence. I have an IEnumerable of a string, right? And I want to pass it to a method, but the method is typed as taking IEnumerable of object. And the compiler, quite rightly, in its opinion, says, well, a sequence of strings is not a sequence of objects. Well, why shouldn't it be? Every string in the sequence is an object. So what we've done is we have enabled the ability to mark certain interfaces which are known to be safe for covariance or contravariance, so that you can then safely at compile time and then at runtime make this conversion and say, well, this sequence of giraffes can be used as a sequence of animals, right? Or to say, so that would be an example of covariance. An example of contravariance would be something that goes in the other direction. Suppose you have an IComparable, right? You have an interface that can compare two things, right? Well, if you have an interface that represents the ability to compare two animals, then that thing can also compare two giraffes, right? So that would be an example of contravariance, because the direction of convertibility goes against the direction of convertibility for the type arguments for the animals and the giraffes.
Okay. So do you have any advice for people who now want to exploit this new feature?
Well, I think it's one of those features that I would not like get too excited about. I mean, it's the thing that I think has surprised a lot of people up until us adding this feature is that even for starting in .NET 1.0, arrays have always been covariant in .NET and in C#, in VB, in all of our programming languages. And for example, you know, to stick with your analogy, if you had a string array, you could assign it to a variable whose type is object array, because we support covariance. But we have not supported the same kind of covariance for generic types, and therefore people get surprised that I can take a string array and put it in an object array variable, but I can't take an IEnumerable string and put it in an IEnumerable of object variable. Why is that? Well, it's because we didn't support co-contravariance, and now we do. And now you get to do the things that you would intuitively expect to be able to do. Now, below the surface then is a bunch of type theory and technicalities around exactly how did this work and what are the restrictions and so forth. And you know, I think there's probably not enough time to get into those at this point here, but you know, but suffice it to say that we do have co-contravariance for interfaces and also for delegate types now as a native language feature and as a native feature in .NET as well, you know, in the CLR.
So in order to, if I should summarize like the whole conversation here. Could you say that a motto for C# 4.0 is, it just works?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's like make dynamic programming better. But then the minute you scratch under the surface, well, and start asking yourself, well, what is dynamic programming? Well, then dynamic programming is many different things, right? It could be talking to a dynamic programming language. It could be talking to the Office automation model. It could be talking to the JavaScript DOM, you know, and so. But under that whole umbrella is really sort of where you find all of the different language features that we've added in C# 4.0.
Okay, well, thanks.
Sure.
For more information, visit onpodcastweekly.com and subscribe to all our podcasts. Brought to you by the publishing imprints and information portal of Pearson Education.